Thank you, everybody, for coming. It's great to see you all. Again, my name is Richard Belshaw. I am a priest in the Episcopal Church here on the seacoast, currently doing supply work, not in any one parish. I'm the facilitator for We the People this year. And we have a great panel tonight to discuss a most important subject, climate change. And we are being recorded tonight by Herb Moyers, who will, if the last panel discussion I did was any indication, is going to have this up on YouTube in no time, which was great. Thank you very much, Herb. And so, I hope you have something on the green cards. You can think about it. You don't have to fill them in right away. But I think everybody in the room has heard that now, so that's our activity. So we live...
Some folks didn't get a green card.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
There's some around, maybe somebody in the committee can...
Thanks very much.
I'll take one.
So if you come in late, the question on the board here is name an activity important to you that requires you to interact with the environment. We're asking you to write that down on one side, and at the end we'll have a question on what did you learn tonight that could or already is influencing that activity. And we'll be handing them in, and the panelists will be checking them out to see what everybody said. I want to start out just briefly by just a couple of words here on why we're here. We live in an age of risk. I'm not so sure it's threat as threat was when I was growing up in the early 60s in Dover, Delaware, where I remember in grade school we had bomb drills because we thought a nuclear bomb was going to be dropped in a minute, and we had to get underneath our desks and cover our heads whenever the bell rang, not like a fire drill, it was beeping and not in one continuous drone. I don't feel that we live in that kind of threat. But we do live in an age of risk that could lead to a real threat. The natural proclivity, the natural stance that we have as a people seems to be, well, somebody else can deal with it, or it's so big I don't know how to deal with it, or maybe I don't even believe that climate change exists. My son takes a course in the Oyster River High School called Debate and Persuasion. And last week I was at a clergy conference and I told this story, and Steve was there and heard this, that about a week and a half ago in his class, they were discussing topics for the next debate, which they have very regularly. And one of the students in the class said, why don't we debate about if there's climate change or not? And my son said, that's not a debatable subject. When 98% of all the world's scientists say, yes, there is climate change, that's not a debatable subject. It led to a full class debate on whether it could be a debate. And my son was a little hot when he came home because he thought he kind of went overboard a little bit. But it made me think, as a parent, I am so happy that they had that discussion. But then I thought, well, this is sad they had that discussion because isn't it obvious? And then I thought, well, what is the school doing to kind of send the message that, yes, 98% of all scientists have decreed that we are living in a recognizable climate change era, or time. And it made me realize that we're all in this together. This is not about any one of us or any group of us or any denomination of us. We have to work together as a community to do what we can to either adapt, to climate change or to mitigate climate change, and the panelists will have more to say about those as we go along. It's not something we can do on our own. And so community is a very important word or concept that I want everybody to keep in mind tonight as we listen to our panelists. Second thing is conscience. What is our conscience telling us to do? William Stringfellow, a famous theologian in his day, in the 60s and 70s, wrote that the conscience is not an individual, it's not arrived at individually. It necessarily involves a community context. It necessarily involves historical connection, and it necessarily involves human experience, the discipline of human experience. I love that reference to conscience. It's not an individual consensus. It's a group consensus that informs. So what is conscience telling us as a people? To me, it was a little challenging putting this panel together because it was putting the practical and the spiritual side by side. And not always does the practical and the spiritual talk to each other. But this panel is a way to find out if we can. And I think by thinking of community and conscience, that's one way for us all, regardless of what faith denomination we come from or what spiritual practice we lead, or even if we don't have any at all, that there's something in those two words that unifies us and that we can harness to combat climate change. So without further ado, let me introduce the panel. We have Semra Aytur from UNH, who is and I'm going to mess up, but I'm sorry.
An epidemiologist.
Epidemiologist.
Yes.
Which is basically the study of disease and
wellness in communities.
Okay. Next to her, we have the Reverend Stephen Blackmer, who is an Episcopal priest. And we're very excited in the Episcopal Church to have Steve because he was just ordained to do a very new thing the Episcopal Church, at least in New Hampshire, has never done before, which is to start an emerging church congregation, if you will, called Church of the Woods, a parish without a building that meets in the woods. And Steve will tell you more about that. Next to Steve, we have Professor David Burdick, also from UNH, who is a fisheries and marshland wetlands expert. Am I?
Not so much fisheries.
Not so much fisheries. Wetlands, okay. You know something about fisheries.
Not probably less than the combined.
Okay. David and Semra are part of a larger group that I made mention to, I think, called CAPE, which I will let them describe, but it's basically a large group of people from UNH who are interested in how we can educate and bring issues of climate change to Exeter. I'll leave it at that.
Sure.
And finally, we have the Reverend Kendra Ford, who is the minister of the Unitarian Universalist congregation here in Exeter and has been for 13 years. So we have and I remember, Kendra, you told me when we met a number of weeks ago that climate change is one of the two big top issues that you are confronting as a congregation in your church. So this has significant interest for you in your parish. We have a wonderful mix here of two professors, two ministers, and the plan is to have everybody on the panel speak for about 5 minutes. Just describe what they do and what they would like. They can say anything they want. It's all loose. And then we'll have a moment if any of you want to respond to each other, and then we'll have open the floor to questions so anybody can ask, and we'll just see where the dialogue goes. So, Semra, you're first.
Sure, okay. Do I have to stand up or can I sit?
No.
Okay. So I hope this is working. So I'm Semra Aytur again, and as Richard said, I'm an epidemiologist. My primary focus is really studying how the environment, and we can talk about what that means to each of us, affects health, not only physical health, but mental and a growing interest in spiritual. I haven't approached that in an academic sense, but there's really this increasing understanding that as people, we don't separate our physical health from our mental and our spiritual side. We're just one collective group. And so the study of how the environment actually affects health in these various dimensions is really an emerging body of literature. It is increasingly interdisciplinary, so I have colleagues like Dave and people all over the country who are touching on different facets of this. And I'm going to keep it really, probably not saying a lot right now because I'd like to see what you wrote on your cards and see if we can keep the conversation very interactive, talk about what kinds of things bubble to the surface for you. But I really want to speak briefly about the CAPE project too, which Richard mentioned, and that is Climate Adaptation Plan for Exeter. What this really is a 2-year project funded by I always have to read this part, the Great Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve. And it's a collaborative science project. What that means is it's about you, really. It's more about citizens of Exeter partnering with UNH to develop an adaptation plan. We are about a year into the project with another year to go. And a primary purpose is for this endeavor to be collaborative. It's really not meant to be something that scientists do in isolation and then bring to a community. It's meant to be about the 2 words we spoke of before, community and conscience or values. So what things do you care about? What things do you hope to really provide stewardship for future generations? And how can scientists bring you the best available evidence and some technical assistance to help a community develop a plan to go forward into the future? So that's what this project is about, and we're happy to talk more about that later, but I will pass it on to our next panelist.
If you'll, excuse me, I'm more comfortable standing up. So, I'm Steve Blackmer. As Richard mentioned, just recently ordained in the Episcopal Church in, the beginning of September. So it really wasn't very long ago. And perhaps the place to begin is to tell you a little bit about why that happened. I'd never been a churchgoer. My whole life growing up, I'd never been to church. I'd been to look at paintings or to go to a concert or something like that, but I'd never actually gone to church. And here I am, finding myself ordained and serving. I serve part-time at St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Concord, and as Richard mentioned, starting this new Church of the Woods based in Canterbury. Climate change was a big part of that transition in my life. Prior to ordination, I was an environmental activist. So why did I need to leave the world of environmental activism in order to become a Christian and a priest in order to deal with climate change? That's sort of the besetting question of my life right now. I was trained as a forest ecologist first and spent 25 years working as a forest activist, conserving land, worked with the Society for Protection of New Hampshire Forests and the Appalachian Mountain Club, and created an organization called the Northern Forest Alliance and another one called the Northern Forest Center, working in forest conservation based in New Hampshire, but all around the Northeast. Did great stuff. I mean, it was really wonderful, wonderful, wonderful work. And then there came a point where, in thinking about climate change, or worrying about climate change, about the change that's going on in our world, that I found myself called to an utterly different way of addressing that fundamental issue. I draw a distinction that I find helpful in thinking about climate change between optimism and hope. I find very little reason to be optimistic that we will summon the will or the skill or the energy to prevent serious harm from climate change. I just can't imagine a way that we will do that. I look at patterns of fossil fuel consumption and change already underway around the world, and I don't see any reason to be optimistic. But I do find profound reasons to be hopeful. And I think perhaps it's that the ability to speak about that called me from the world of activism and from the world of science into the spiritual world, to talk about where it is that we find hope in the face of despair. And my own journey from that life to this life was one that took me deep into despair, of saying, how can there be solutions here? I don't see them, and yet I believe we will come through. We won't be the same when we come through. It's not going to be easy. It won't be without a great deal of suffering. One of the reasons I think that I have found the Christian faith helpful is because it teaches us a great deal about how to go into suffering and find life on the other side of that. So it's something that has given me a way of speaking about the unspeakable, about death and destruction that I think is going to be massive, particularly for the poorest of the world. Those of us who are relatively wealthy will find a way through, but those who are not will suffer greatly. This, I think, is where we need to be able to talk about the spiritual resources that will get us through those very, very dark times. Richard mentioned one of the concrete things I'm doing to begin this is to create a different kind of church. Church of the Woods, based in Canterbury, New Hampshire, where I live, which is about restoring people's spiritual connections with the earth. I'll do that primarily in a Christian context, but it will also be open to people of all faiths. So it will be both Christian and multi-faith, Episcopal and ecumenical. But a way of recognizing the earth in Christian terms as the first incarnation, the whole universe as the first outpouring of God's self, coming into being, into physical being, and a way of developing spiritual practice particularly focused around environmental issues and climate change. So that's what I'm about, and I'm very glad to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Wish I was last. Well, I haven't advanced to Steve's position yet because...
David, maybe closer to you.
Oh, am I too far away? Okay. I haven't really advanced to his position. I still sort of believe that my doing science is the best way to connect people to nature or lead managers in such a way that people are not isolated from nature.
And we need that, so thank you.
So my work focuses on salt marshes and seagrasses. I also work with oyster reefs with Ray Grizzle at Jackson Lab. And the more I've been thinking over the last 4 or 5 years, I really try to work with these very interesting communities that create themselves. These animal communities and plant communities create the habitat that we call them. So if we take a drive to the ocean from Exeter, we'll see, we might go along the river and we may see a marsh. Well, we all recognize it as a marsh. And as we get close to the ocean, we may see sand dunes. We all recognize those as sand dunes. We all recognize the beach. We all recognize forest. Why are there not more types of systems? It's because the organisms in these systems, largely plants, dominating a lot of them, interact with the environment in such a way as to keep themselves the same. And so they maintain themselves in what we call a dynamic equilibrium. They don't stay the same all the time. They're always changing. They're always changing in response to climate, cold years, warm years, pet disease, all kinds of disturbances, but they maintain themselves as their communities. And of course, when we interact with the human community, I think everybody here would like to see the same sort of community they have now go on in the future as well. So that ability to resist disturbance or rebound from disturbance is called resiliency or resilience, and you'll see that word used a lot with climate change. How can we be resilient to climate change? How can we allow those changes to happen and make adaptations so we can keep the type of community that we want to live in? And so that's very important to me. Another thing that's important to me is our children. It's made me very sad to understand that a lot of our children just get more and more disconnected with nature. And I work with 5th graders in Portsmouth, trying to bring them out and show them ways that they do interact with nature and can interact with nature. And I have a lot of fun doing that. But my work on the Cape project with Semra is to work with a bunch of engineers. Semra and I are saddled up against about 8 different engineers. And the engineers are going to tell us, oh, we just build this or create that. And Semra and I are going like, well, so how does the community use their natural environment, and how will the sort of responses, the sort of adaptations the engineers might show us, is that going to really be an improvement to our quality of life? Yeah, we'll stop the water from going over, but if no one sees the water anymore because the wall's so high, gee, is that where you want to live? So these are the things that Semra and I are going to be wrestling with over the next year. And we don't want to have personally, I don't want to have the responses to climate change be isolating ourselves from the environment. It's riskier not to, it's more risky to, invite the environment in, especially if we're going to have more extreme conditions. But that still may be healthier for us as a community to do that, rather than to isolate ourselves off. I think that's it.
I'm Kendra Ford, and I'm the minister at the Unitarian Universalist congregation around the corner. And I live in Portsmouth, so I am part of both of those communities. And we've, my husband and now baby, some of you got to see him, he left just before we got started. We're really pleased to be living on the seacoast because of what's happening here about environmentalism and thinking about how to live differently. That's one of the many reasons that we're pleased to be living here in this moment. My husband and I lived with one car for about 5 years in one of our personal attempts to reduce our impact for climate change. And it is a really interesting way to live in the world now, because we had to walk a lot, which was fantastic. It takes longer, and you have to think about it, but you get connected to the natural world in a way that, as you've probably noticed, you don't when you're in your car. So that's my personal experience with this. The other thing I think I should probably do is tell you what Unitarian Universalism is. A few of you here in the room are Unitarian Universalists, but Unitarian Universalism is sometimes a little bit of a mystery to folks, because in a Christian context we're not really Christian anymore, and so it was hard to say, what are we? So I brought some sheets that define our principles, which you're welcome to take if you want one, if you want to see some of the language that says what we are. But I think the most important thing to know about Unitarian Universalists is that we're a covenantal tradition, which means that our religious life is about how you live and what you do and the choices that you make, and not about the creeds that you agree to. And in a Christian context, it's a different way of inhabiting religion. Certainly, Christianity asks people to live in certain ways and make certain choices. that's the emphasis in Unitarian Universalism. So that's why I brought our principles, because this is the articulation of our covenant with the world. And that's, I think, how we approach environmental work and concern about climate change. That we have a covenant with the world, and we have to live into that set of holy agreements with all of life around us. And the person that I turn to for a lot of this work, who articulates a lot of the same things that have already been said, actually comes from the Buddhist tradition, Joanna Macy. She talks a lot about how to reconnect to the natural world. And it's her belief that the reason we're not connected to the natural world is that we're so overwhelmed with grief and sort of brokenness about what has happened to the natural world because of what we've done, that we just can't stand to look at it. And so we look away. We look at, what are the things you've looked at today? Screens, and you drive our cars, and we stay busy and do all kinds of things, and anything to avoid looking at how bad it actually is. I would say that climate change is a threat. It's just a slow motion threat. It's not something that's going to drop in the next 10 minutes, but like a tsunami, they're coming and they're a threat, even if they're not at the shore yet. So Joanna Macy asks people for their environmental work to do some really deep work about grieving, about how disconnected we are from the natural world, about what a loss it is that we're so disconnected. And it's hard work, and it's interesting to start environmental work with grief work. But I think it's very effective. I watched my little boy, we were walking across the churchyard together, and I put him down on the grass for a few minutes, and he just looked at the grass and the leaves on the ground like, it was just a wonder. And, if we're lucky, we get a couple of minutes like that as adults, but he remembers that sense of, I can't believe I'm here for this, just all the time. And we lose it. And Joanna Macy, like lots of people, tries to help us recover that. And she says you can get back to that if you notice how much we've lost. And then you can begin to sit in the yard with the leaves and see how much there is to be amazed by. And it's that sense of amazement and connection that can give us the strength to engage what is a very difficult problem in the world. It's only by loving something completely and being amazed by it that you really can stay after a really difficult, both scientific and spiritual problem. The other thing that I think is important from my perspective about this is that there really is there's no divide between the practical and the spiritual. Just as we've divided ourselves from the natural world, but there's actually no division. There's no division between what the scientists are working on and what folks in spiritual communities are working on. We just have to refine the connections. They're there. We just have to uncover them again. So here we are, I think, to do some of that.
Thank you, Kendra. So maybe a common theme with all of you was relationship. I think I've heard a lot of language about relationship as opposed to we're in this for ourselves individually. So there's a strong community tie here. I know that the issue of climate change has a big financial, economic, a big brother authority even element to it. And to the point where risk management, if you will, has become a huge thing to deal with the huge thing, which is climate change. And I'm wondering, because we're here in Exeter, we really would like to focus a little bit on Exeter. Do any of you have any suggestions or any comments about how we can find that right relationship in community, in government, or in our town government or state government, or if that's impossible, or any thread that you can take out of this?
I don't need that. I think Exeter's town government is ready to move whatever direction the people of Exeter want them to move. I think they're extremely responsive. We've been working with Sylvia von Ollock, and she's just been absolutely fabulous.
Okay, so easy answer.
From my perspective.
Okay. Any of you would like to respond to what anybody else has said, or add to anything that you would like to say, and then we'll open up for questions?
I guess, I might not need that either, but I think that I completely agree with Dave. I work with a lot of different communities on a whole bunch of different issues, and this government to me does seem like they truly want to hear what people think. I mean, that's my impression after spending about a year here, and we work with fantastic town representatives. Sylvia, Dave already mentioned, are truly giving above and beyond their time to be very engaged in this process. But I think part of why I'm so happy to be here is we do, in America, always have a lot of conversations about money. And, not that those are not important, and especially a town has to do budgets and make sure that there's enough money to pay for different things, and those conversations are incredibly important. But I think for myself, just having some other conversations about the kinds of other values, or even if it's non-monetary things that we've started to talk about here, that many of us might agree are at least as important or very important to our quality of life. I think those conversations have to happen too, and have a place at the table in things like the CAPE, the Climate Adaptation Plan, other kinds of decision-making that really has to do with quality of life. And the other thing that I heard Kendra mention is, even though we are talking about town government, much of the thinking and the decisions we make about how to live, we are part of a global community, and we have choices that other people around the world or other people down the street from us or another town from us over may not have. And being mindful about how we are shaping the world in small ways but very profound ways. That's just something that I try to remember.
Which is the essence of act locally, think globally, that bumper sticker.
Right.
I'm going to open it up for questions. If anybody has a question, raise your hand.
Look, I'm really puzzled. I really appreciate the panel. I love the fact that at least 4 dozen people are here. I wish it was as large as the group we heard Hedrick Smith last Wednesday night, which is 4 times as many. Because this is such an urgent issue, and I don't hear the urgency. That's what puzzles me. To me, we're facing a situation of incredible danger. And I want to cross-cut the statistics because I think if we rely on our own senses, we know there's climate change. And I want to make an analogy, if you will, very quickly, and then I'll put my question. I see a system that's in breakdown for the earth as a whole. I see a physical system that is no longer self-correcting. It's no longer self-regulating. And that's on the physical side. On the political side, where we look for solutions, I see a similar situation because on both sides there are vicious cycles at work. On the political side, I also see a system which has ceased to be self-correcting. So there's the analogy. What's the solution in light of that diagnosis? What do you see as things that need to be done so that we can, in response to this question, the point about money, such an important point. And also the other pastors, the church in the wood. I love it. I love the title. Anyway, you know, we're talking about things that are beyond money and their value. It's the value of human life. How is human life to be preserved on this earth?
I'm going to adjust your question, if I may. It isn't just human life. It's life with a capital L, meaning all of the living beings who are, just as you have said, whose lives have gotten so out of balance that they can no longer come back if they need to, that other non-human species are dying, becoming extinct at an alarming rate. And so that the life of the planet is really at stake, and not only human lives. And the human lives, you know, obviously we notice those first because those are our lives, right? I think the answer is, as it always is, when there's some kind of profound change that needs to happen, like occurred with the civil rights movement, like occurred when Gandhi led his fight for liberation with his people, is that the people have to decide that they're willing to risk a lot to have the world they want. So the government's probably not going to do it. It's you. It's us. We have to decide what we want to have happen, and then we have to organize ourselves to have it. It's a short answer for a massive change in the world. I've brought some books for a process called Transition Towns. They've happened in the United Kingdom, if I'm right. Have you heard about transition towns?
No.
And they may be something for you to find out about. It's about towns, small towns, getting together and having lots of conversations about how are we going to live in a world that's in balance? How are we going to create our own lives and not wait for someone somewhere else to have the answer, but to start in our town? And I think Exeter is actually a great town for this, because we're small enough to be able to work things out together. And there is a government that's in this town that's supportive and congenial, and you start it household by household, town by town, and you start a movement that's bigger than your own work, and that's not waiting for the debate about whether this is actually happening to be completed, because, as you said, the experience tells us that the debate was long ago over. Does that answer your question?
That's helpful, thank you.
From my perspective here, we're in a microcosm of the world right here. What's the town of Exeter doing to prevent the vicious cycle of algae destroying eelgrass and other living things in Great Bay? Not much. So we have to make some decisions locally, because those same vicious cycles that are destroying the physical world on the grand scale are destroying our environment and how we use our natural capital right in our own backyard. And so we have to, again, I think it's one of those things where people have to decide this is what's right and this is the right thing to do, and we're going to move ahead this way, as opposed to wait. When we wait, as the gentleman who proposed the question puts out, these vicious cycles come in to play. And as an ecologist, we have this one, we're left with this wonderful dynamic environment of low oxygen, huge clouds of sulfur gas coming off of Great Bay, and no living things in Great Bay. When the algae take over, they all die, and when you have 3 or 4 days of cloudy weather, they die, and there's no oxygen in the whole bay, and everything dies. And as an ecologist, you say, wow, look at this is kind of interesting, but I wouldn't want to live there. So, got to do something.
That's the huge question. There's no doubt.
I'm feeling very impatient. We are sitting in, well, I won't reach this one. That's all right, I'll show.
You're loud.
I'm attending the CAVE meetings. I'm looking for solutions. I'm hearing about some defensive measures. I'm not hearing about how we move toward even community solutions for the problems. And tonight I came here looking for solutions, and I'm hearing a lot of good philosophy, but I'm not hearing a way forward. And I think we have to begin to look. How do we reduce carbon in Essex? How do we reduce it at Riverwoods, where I live? How do we reduce the nitrogen going down to the Great Bay? We can't just do it through sewer treatment because that only takes a fraction of it. We have to get at the runoff. We have to somehow move people with money motives maybe, to do something about their runoff and to prevent, and what about new growth? We can't just say, it's okay, we're just going to open a new parking lot here, there, or everywhere. We've got to have some mechanism by which that growth is either curbed or it's done in the right way. It's a Leeds building or it's a permeable parking or what have you. We've got to find measures to do something. It's not enough to just talk about it.
As a employee of the town of Durham, I actually televise all their town meetings, second job I have. I can attest to that town, it sounds like Exeter is similar, being very, very aware of all environmental issues, as many as they can keep track of in terms of planning, in terms of building new buildings and wanting builders to use LEED certification plans. And stormwater runoff is a huge deal there. They're creating rain gardens and public parking lots and all this kind of stuff. And I wonder if your question attaches itself to the interactive interconnectedness of things, where there's not any one way other than to speak up and to act up and to make sure that your local government, at the very least, moving on up, has a firm understanding of the will of the people. Because ultimately, I think the will of the people decide things. And it may not be an answer you want to hear, or that we want to hear, but maybe that's it. But I'd love to hear what somebody else has to say on that, if at all.
Well, as far as our jobs on the Cape, the Climate Action Plan for Exeter, it's just going to take time. We haven't seen the model outputs. So we don't know how the nitrogen, we don't know how climate's going to change the amount of nitrogen coming through. So, you know, it's a process, and we needed to start when we started, and it's going to take us some months to do it.
And I think the part that we've talked a lot amongst ourselves, because it is frustrating, I realize that there are some things that we can't do everything in one project. So the carbon issue, I know we've had a couple of conversations, extremely important, nobody denies that, but because of what CAPE in particular was charged to do, was focus more on the water and the flooding related issues, I realized that compartmentalizes things in a way that wouldn't really make sense to a lot of people, but it's part of, like Dave said, we had to start somewhere and begin the conversation somewhere. Everything that you've said about carbon is being recorded and will be included. It's just that the particular focus of CAPE had to really tackle the flooding and water issues first. And the smart growth issues, for what I'll just call the development pieces of what you mentioned, really are being included in terms of some of the scenarios that are being played out. As Dave said, we don't have the results of that yet, but what will happen under different conditions of growth, development, how different types of green infrastructure is or is not included, those things are at least being built into the scenarios of the modeling process. So it's a starting point. I can totally relate to the frustration, and in a way it seems backward that we're not maybe getting to the root. But where someone mentioned hope, and to me there's hope in doing what you can with what you have. And right now, I really feel that everyone who's a part of the project is truly bringing that spirit to it, and hopefully that will allow other connections to be made.
I hear suffering and grief from these prior comments, and so I'm wondering, our clergy touched upon both of those, and I'm wondering how, in kind of specific ways, how we grasp a hold of that and start to use that in a positive kind of way.
I can take a first crack at that because I think it's a really good question. I'm going to begin by reading something that came across my email yesterday, actually, and I said, oh, this is relevant to this evening. So I'm just going to quote a little tiny piece of something written by a guy who writes for a blog called The Daily Climate, and he's based in Bozeman, Montana. He's writing about Native American leaders in Montana, talking about climate change and environmental issues. Their message, they being these Native American leaders, their message is this: you cannot treat the earth with disrespect and not expect consequences. You cannot poison the soil, pollute the air, dirty the water, kill other forms of life, and not have problems. Those consequences are already manifest. They are all around us. And yet, they continue, all the momentum behind the quest for solutions focuses on technological remedies, new energy sources, new drilling techniques, new science. What we forget, and what the elders are telling us, is that our attitude is at the heart of the change, not the latest breakthrough technology or policy. I think that is where we are. Putting it in, there's a little bit of a pessimist's hat I'm wearing here, but if you look at this part of the world, we have been creating these problems for round numbers since 1750 or 1800, right? This is not brand new. We've got, let's say, again, simple terms, 300 years worth of doing these things. We're not going to turn that around overnight. There's no way, particularly now, since the techniques that we've developed perfected so well. Yes, we learned them from England, but we've perfected them so well, we've spread them around the whole world. I mean, this is one of the great American exports, right? Is how to do this. Exactly what they're describing there. That's not going to be turned around overnight. So part of it is recognizing how complicit we all are in this. I drove a car to get here. Yes, I had one passenger, but that didn't change either the effect of the drilling for oil, the processing for oil, the pollution that came out of my tailpipe, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Mea culpa, I'm a part of the solution. I can't fix it all. None of us can fix it all. What we can do, I think, is exactly what you were just saying, is find the little pieces that we can do. Even if the world is going to go to hell, we can make this place one that just might make it through. We can create one little green place here, one little bicycle path there, one little solution here, one little solution there, and those will add up. And those little things, small though they may be, are the seeds from which a new world can grow. A new world, we hope, we pray, has a different attitude towards the earth and towards each other. And that is, in fact, I think, a spiritual renaissance rather than an economic. I mean, yes, it'll have economic repercussions and political repercussions, but it is that transformation that happens within each of us, that notwithstanding the fact that we can't change how much coal is being burned in China, we have no influence over that. You just got to accept that there are things that are way beyond our control. What we can do is change ourselves. And that means, I believe at this point, it's something I said to myself, or Spirit said to me as I was contemplating this call to a new change of life: rest in the crucible of anxiety. Just be there. Recognize that that's where we are. That, I think, is the first step. Say, we can't fix it. And much as I would love to have solutions, I don't believe there are solutions to all of these things yet. So, that's a hard one. But it's then as you rest in that crucible of anxiety, then what actions can we take? What things can we do, however small? That's my own sense about it. So.
I'm going to plug Transition Towns again.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because the transition town process is about gathering your community, doing lots of community building with your community, and then doing things like, all right, well, how are we going to drive less? How are we going to set up our town and our riverwoods to use less gas? What are the concrete, practical steps that we're going to do to acknowledge that every time we go somewhere, we're harming the earth? How could we go somewhere more lightly? Make really practical choices like that. But we have to do it by getting together and saying, all right, how are we going to do this together? Because we're going to have to figure it out together. And the Transition Towns process is about getting people together and talking so that it gives us the courage to face the enormity of the problem. I think that's really why we haven't dealt with it, because it does feel like you can't do anything. Yeah. Although I do think you can have an effect on how much coal is burned in China by watching how you use your money. The more stuff we buy, and the more stuff we buy that's manufactured in China, the more we support how much coal is burned in China. I'm not saying that you should never ever buy anything that's ever made in China, because that's terrible. I just think, that simplicity thing, just to be thoughtful about it, because every choice you make affects everything that happens everywhere in the world. It's really that connected. And we forget how every single thing that we do affects the whole world. You can't see it most of the time. You can't stand to see it most of the time. But it's there. And the more you can notice it, the more you have a chance of tugging on how things go. But I do think that that doing the Transition Towns process in Exeter, I think we're uniquely positioned to do this process, and I think it would get you the practical results you're looking for, and that I'm looking for, that we all need. And it would do that relational piece that carries people through.
Yeah. Very easy to get completely disheartened and dismayed by what's happening around the world. The big stuff, what's happening in China, what's happening in Nigeria. The oceans by Lagos, Nigeria, are some of the most polluted ocean water in the world. What's happening in places that, unlike America, have no controls, and people can do whatever they want. Another thing aspect of this I'd like to bring up is the over-reliance on human systems and data. We can be lulled into thinking that our leaders are doing everything they can, but we don't always know, and I don't think we should ever consider data retrieval and study and action just a black and white issue. The way I see it, there's a lot of gray and a lot of constantly seeking answers, because it's fluid. The environment is fluid. You have no idea what's going to happen from one month to another. You can't predict it. And I am not a scientist, but my guess is that things build on each other, and there are all sorts of reasons why climate change happens that doesn't ask for a simple solution. I see in all of this a common denominator of you have to speak up, and you have to act, and you have to shout even, and do what you can locally with people that are responding. Does that make sense?
I don't think I need it. I'd like to ask you for a little help, especially you. May I call you Semra? Because you spoke about the the necessary compartmentalization of the work you're all trying to do. You can't possibly attack all the ills of the world all at once. But for our daily lives, for us to take this home with us tonight, can you give us a ranking of the biggest issues facing civilization?
I may need a little help from my friends.
We took out suffering, you have to rank.
So, for example, water is already being worked on, right?
Yeah. So I think that it comes back to two things. One is to think about your own, so you're from Exeter, right? You live here. So connect with people here around what means the most to you as a starting point. Whether those are issues about, maybe it is the Great Bay and water. A community that really taught me much of what we're talking about today. I worked in a community in North Carolina. It was a very low-income community, and they were one of the first communities of freed slaves in America. And we had conversations about what the land meant to them. The reason we started there is they taught me that for them, their sense of personhood and being counted as a human being, having been taken from their own land, was what their sense of stewardship to the land that they have now, being able to produce food on their land that they didn't export. They were trying to, it sounds so simple, going back to the act locally, all they were trying to initially get my help for was start a farmer's market. You know, we have farmer's markets everywhere. It doesn't sound like a big deal. But for them, they needed to change some things about their town government to have permission to open it. And then it was part of their idea of, we are not producing food for somebody else. We're producing food on land that we own for our community, for our church. Was a very strong faith-based community. And that was the starting point to not only what bound the town together, what they felt connected them to. We've had a little bit of talk about social movements, about other broader things, whether it's civil rights, whether it's justice, whether it's peace. I'm just throwing some out here. And those things that resonate, number one with you, it has to be in your heart, and then you find the other hearts and they're out there. And that community showed me where they are. And now I kind of walk through trying to connect with other people to find out where that spark will fly. And once it does, things can happen. They may not happen immediately, but they can happen in very small but profound ways. And they can happen in ways that don't necessarily require money or government as much as we like to think they do.
Listen to what she said.
That was perfect. Absolutely. I wanted to say a couple of things. Guess what? They've all been covered. Really well said.
Yeah, absolutely right.
I was going to add environmental justice, but I think you.
They taught me what environmental justice meant.
The very short version of what you said is something I learned years ago in San Francisco. Start where you are.
Yeah.
Use what you have, and do what you can.
Yeah.
To educate the local population about specific environmental issues that face Exeter or the surrounding area, and how those issues may or may not be impacted by long-term climate changes. It's all well and good to say that you have a cooperative local government, but many of these things come down to specific recommendations in the form of warrant articles, and people vote on those, and they need to be educated as to what they're voting on and why.
Semra, Britt, I think she could do a better job on this than myself anyway. But We have a small presence on the town website as the Cape Project, and we are planning 2 community meetings, or community-wide meetings. One, well, actually, we completed one in the spring, and when we start getting results rolling in, we will communicate the results to bring people up on what we expect from climate change, and then we'll have another meeting of what are the solutions. And that's when we're going to have the town government involved, and hopefully the people and the government, because a lot of times you get a government official that says, oh, this isn't going to work because X, Y, and Z has to be here in this. And that's the sort of help we need from the town if the people decide this is the right sort of recommendation measure. So it's a communication process that's not easy. It's going to take a long time. And we expect fully to have, to take a whole year. And it's not going to solve the nitrogen problem in Great Bay, but it might, hopefully, we can attack a part of it. That's not really why I'm here, talking about nitrogen. Or that's not necessarily why I'm part of the Cape Project. It's really about listening to the people, listening to you all. And I recognize that without education, you might not have the right questions, but we have to start somewhere. And so we are starting a back and forth dialogue. That's what dialogue is all about. I had my computer here. We're hoping to show some slides before we actually started tonight. That would be somewhat educational. I think it shows a little bit of Semra's viewpoints, and it shows a little bit where I'm coming from. But just something for the town people to know in Exeter, that if you have a salt marsh, that salt marsh right now, my measurements just up the street in Stratton, is that salt marsh is building at over 4 millimeters a year. The only reason that salt marsh is building 4 millimeters a year is that because sea level must be rising at least 4 millimeters a year. Because the salt marsh will build only if sea level rises. That's how it works. And one of the interesting things is all the local data say it's 1.76 millimeters a year up through 2000. The newest satellite data for the world is 3.6 millimeters a year. Our backyard is showing 4.5 millimeters a year. So I think we're a little behind the curve. So I think sea level is rising about 6 millimeters a year right now. But to understand that you have a system in town that's actually going to build with sea level rise up to some point. At some point, it will probably collapse. But you have a system which is very productive. It helps a lot of habitat, it creates a lot of habitat. It helps a lot of other organisms. It denitrifies, so it gets nitrogen out of the system. So there's a lot of positive things. And walling that off, that's why I'm here. I don't want it to be walled off where it can't function. So I hear you, and I think that the education is really important. But the whole process, the whole idea of our project is to have a dialogue, so it's a back and forth. So I will educate where I have opportunities.
And I'd like to add to that too that, well, first, so there's a little plug. We're updating our website. So there's www.capenh.net. And that hopefully is still really being beefed up right now, but it will be a place where some educational material can be exchanged. But as Dave said, I think education, we definitely can, as wearing our scientific hats, we can add to information that is out there. But there's a tremendous opportunity to educate each other, especially about those things that are more about meaning and more about the things we care about, and maybe not quite as data-driven. Data is super important. We do have a lot of that. We have a great climatologist. We have a whole interdisciplinary team, and we'll do our part. But there are techniques that are more related to things that people who live in a community can do. Taking photographs, sharing narratives, sharing memories, talking to, connecting older generations and younger generations. And that becomes part of education and part of experience, part of lived experience. And without, I think, that two-way process that Dave mentioned, we're all partners in education, and to the extent that we can support each other, I think that would be the best way to approach it.
I was told that the drinking water was not good, and my son had a filter system in his home, and I got a filter system for my drinking water. And I wonder, are things still as bad as they were? Are they better? Are they worse? And what can we, the panel and the audience, do just about that one thing as a way of starting something if we need to?
Good question. Who would like to respond?
Yeah, I just learned about this at our CAPE meeting because, our CWG meeting, because the people in Exeter were talking about it. So we have these trihalomethanes in our water. And trihalomethanes in the drinking water, we don't know how carcinogenic they are, but, they're there and they're above the levels that are established as safe. So that means that the town needs to react to try to get those removed from the water. Now, if you're going to drink surface water, so you guys are drinking surface water, it's from the water in the reservoir. The new approach EPA has since the 70s, when some strange little diseases, very small diseases, started making people sick in large groups and causing death, cryptosporidium. The EPA, in reaction to that, said, okay, if you're going to have surface water, you have to chlorinate it. Now, our surface water here has organic matter in it. And if you chlorinate the organic matter, you get trihalomethanes. So their job was to get all the organic matter out that they can, then treat it with the chlorine, and then try to get rid of the trihalomethanes. It's not always perfect, and that's why people recommend to have an activated charcoal filter in their house for their drinking water. Portsmouth has the same problem. I live in Portsmouth. We have trihalomethanes, and I just live with it. My personal view is it's not as big a threat as some of these other issues that we've been talking about, but I respect that, and the town is very responsive, and they're going to put a brand new, they're building a new treatment center, a treatment facility for fresh water specifically to deal with that issue. So I think the town is moving on that, actually. And I don't know how long it's going to take, 3 years or so before that's in there, but for $50 a year, and if you want to filter your water, filter your water. I usually boil mine, and that, because I usually just drink I have a filter in my refrigerator, and I drink that. And if I'm going to make tea, I make it from the tap, and I just let it boil for a minute and drive off some of the chlorine. That's my own personal response to it. I don't think it's a climate change issue, but I think it does show how officials in Exeter are responding. I mean, there's a new water system, treatment system planned for the city. And I don't know how far along it is, but it's moving along.
Scientific research side. One is the U.S. Geological Survey, Bulletin 17B, which is the 1 in 100-year flood recurrence interval calculation, is about to be reissued. And being it's a bulletin, it doesn't need to go up for public review or comment. And right now they're saying they don't see a climate change signal. The way they calculated this is they took remote river stations where there's not been any development on the watershed and used those, which means they basically excluded all the coastal areas when they did this work. Is anyone aware of this, and is there anyone thinking about taking action on that? And the other one is there's a project over at UNH called Groundwinds. It's a LiDAR system that was going to be put on the satellites. And there's been a discontinuity in the funding in that work. They put $10 million into that project that was capable of measuring the wind in the atmosphere around the world. And it also would measure aerosols, so you could fly over a country with this sensor and be able to tell you exactly which power plants are putting out what. Which is, I think, I think there was a couple of things there. The Air Force certainly didn't want to have anything to do with this, which would be the logical people to fly it. And I don't think, the Bush administration, where this was being funded out of, wanted any more Earth remote sensing. It looked like there were funds cut throughout the spectrum of stuff, and I haven't seen any action to restore any of that.
Thank you.
So we do have, I guess, so I want to say a couple of things. So unfortunately, I do not have the expertise to answer that question, but we have on our team, I mentioned it's a very interdisciplinary team, and we do have a climatologist who would definitely know about that. To the best of my knowledge, the LIDAR data is still being collected. However, your point about funding being cut, yes, there were drastic cuts since the time that you referenced, not only to that program, but pretty much scientific cuts across the board, EPA, NIH, NSF. We really are not even keeping pace with inflation in terms of what funding for science used to be. But regardless of that, I know that LIDAR is still going. What it includes, though, and in terms of whether the components that you talked about have been no longer included, I don't know, but there's somebody we can ask who we work with very closely on our team. We just don't have to have him here at the table, so we can find out. And the other thing I wanted to mention, which plays into a larger picture of these issues, we've talked very much about Exeter, about Cape. How many folks were aware that the state of New Hampshire now has been funded to develop a state climate adaptation plan? How many folks were aware of that? Yeah? All right, great. So another chance to get involved. You know, we're thinking local, moving up to state, and hopefully even bigger. But we did receive funding from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention to develop a 4-year climate adaptation plan for the state. That funding is being filtered through DHHS in partnership with DES. So the reason I'm mentioning this is it's really an opportunity for the first time to bring together some of these questions about environmental health and preparing for climate change that have traditionally been looked at either through one state agency doing their own thing and another state agency doing their own thing in a silo, and now there's at least a mechanism to try to bring those perspectives together, to involve people in the process, and it's another opportunity that gets a little bit beyond what a project like CAPE can do. So I just wanted to mention that as well.
I was thinking along the lines of asking the panel, having heard the last few questions, about how you see the EPA and the whatever government programs and groups there are actually being responsive these days. Is it just incredibly frustrating to work with the government in the state or in Washington? Do you feel that there's progress in the light of some real fears that people have about the future that we've heard very eloquently stated tonight? What is your thought? What are your thoughts about that relationship?
I don't mind. It's probably going to be, this is probably not going to be the opinion that many scientists would state, but I actually recently had what I think is a really positive sign for the direction that things are going, and albeit it's a very small piece. So we just had a question about the larger, very, very big question about funding and how funds are appropriated for different priorities in our country, which could be a whole other conversation. But what gave me hope is just a very personal interaction with EPA recently. And a lot of the work that I do, we've heard a little bit about it. It is looking at issues much like Kendra talked about. How do we build communities that are really intentional about creating conditions for a healthy life, for the future, and for all people, not just for wealthy people, for example, and for people who live in different places all over the world, really. So one of the things that EPA asked me to do, as well as a couple of other scientists, is serve on a very new panel that for EPA is new. It won't sound surprising, I think, to the people in this room, but they now have a Healthy, Sustainable Communities subcommittee within EPA, which is meant to bring the kind of conversation we're having here today about the human dimensions that go beyond were you exposed to a particular chemical or not, or do you have a Superfund site next door to you? Those are very obvious, very direct issues that EPA in the past has tried to do the best they can with. But now we're hearing these bigger places within being carved out within EPA for conversations about what are the word they use is ecosystem services. So all of the things we've talked about tonight are how does the environment affect us, the very first question that you're going to fill out on your little cards, in all those different ways, our mind, our body, our spirit, and beginning to have a place in an agency like EPA where there's scientific input. So I was asked by Senator Shaheen to serve on that panel. As for someone sort of at the beginning of their career, that's to me a really exciting thing to do, and I'm very honored to do that. There are other scientists all over the country who are bringing these issues of human impacts and the environment together, and that chance for cross-conversation is just great. And then the other thing that I think is really exciting is they're developing a new database. Now, we talked about data not being everything, and however, for someone who often tries to show people what those connections between the environment and health are, often you do need some kind of data inputs to demonstrate those relationships. So this is an effort that EPA is helping to support some geographically based tools, so things that have a GIS component. Some of the LiDAR stuff maybe, although I don't know how much that's playing into it, and connecting those to other data systems that we have nationally that show things like rates of disease, all kinds of different things about how people's health collectively either is looking up or not looking up. And believe it or not, we didn't have very good systems in place to be able to connect those dots before. So I see that it might be a drop in the bucket to a lot of people, but it's starting a new conversation and beginning to have tools about showing some of those relationships so that that educational piece can be more credible and more well developed in the future.
Thank you, sir.
It's nice to hear that the EPA is becoming more advanced, but they're going to run up against such dyed-in-the-wool conservative organizations as the NRC. Some of us here are members of the Seacoast Anti-Pollution League. And we know there are a lot of things wrong with Seabrook, and the NRC just won't admit it. And the NRC is currently having hearings on the safety of spent fuel storage. Well, there's no such thing as safety in spent fuel storage, but they go on and on and on with these fictions. So I just wonder whether you think the EPA can possibly prevail against such odds.
And my answer is no. Probably the EPA probably can't. And we had the conversation before about sometimes when putting your efforts elsewhere, almost in a different process, is maybe something to think about. So if it's always going to be tackling a more organized, very powerful interest, right, that is going to block you at every turn, sometimes, and I'm not, familiar enough with that particular issue to suggest what you should do, but taking a step back and saying, which other arenas could we bring this into? Maybe it's backing away from the battle with the EPA and filtering it back through some of these things now going on through DHHS, through the health departments, through the broader conversation around other aspects of the medical community, the public health community. I'm just naming some. They're very related, but they shift the dialogue and they shift the places for you to get your foot in the door just a little bit. Have you heard of a process called health impact assessment before? So there's a new sort of process. It's not really new, and it's just about bringing this focus on health and equity and well-being into all kinds of different processes, housing, transportation, things that aren't about hospitals, but they're very much about health. And there is a group called Human Impact Partners. You might want to check out their website. They're based in Oakland, California, but have really enabled communities around the country, including in Maine and Massachusetts and other parts of New England, to have the kinds of conversations you're talking about, not necessarily with EPA, if that seems to, for one reason or another, not getting you traction, but finding those processes. Maybe it's local government, maybe it's with health departments, maybe it's with the state plan that I just mentioned that's going on, where you can highlight these issues that have to do about health or about different groups of people being impacted differently from other groups of people, and at least give voice to those things. I agree with you that unfortunately when there are such powerful lobbies or groups, butting heads may not always be the way to victory, but I think there are other roads sometimes, and I wish I could know more to name one or work with you on one.
You know, we come from tradition where scripture is full of references to nature. Water, floods, rivers, night and day. I mean, it's all there. The Psalms are full of them. Trees, sycamore trees. As an organic community, in a way, if I can call a church or a spiritual community that, what thoughts might either of you have in terms of, reacting to what you heard tonight, or whatever? I mean, where should we go from here?
Listening to the questions and the comments about EPA and NRC, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, has made me think about the Congress. That wonderful, productive, constructive body that solves so many problems in our country right now. And so I begin to think, well, where is EPA funded? EPA is funded through the Congress. Who influences the Congress? You don't need me to tell you that whole story. That led me to think about moral outrage, which I think, Richard, is my response to your question about what do communities of faith have to give at this point. Clearly, there's a spiritual dimension, but there's simply that dimension you serve, or in your first question, sort of that expression of moral outrage. It's wrong. So much of what we're doing, and again, I'm complicit, so recognizing that, I'm not pure in this. So much of the way we've created our society is morally wrong. It's destructive, it poisons, it kills. You don't have to look very far in the Christian Bible or any other spiritual text to find the clear statements about that. So how do we regain that voice, the voice that was so powerful in the civil rights movement in particular, and in the slavery, anti-slavery civil war? That moral voice that says, fundamentally this is wrong. We don't necessarily know how to fix it. Again, that's part of the problem, except to go back and say there's got to be a different ethical foundation for our society that says it's not okay to poison, it's not okay to pollute, it's not okay to create everything that kills. That's a wrong foundation for our whole society, and as long as that foundation remains wrong, we will get wrong results, inevitably. And we are living in a civilization that is the inheritors, the bearers of that. So we've got to go back to that fundamental root and say, how do we rebuild something on a moral foundation that is right? That, again, that's not an overnight solution, but without that, I don't see any other way to deal with these things.
We keep referencing the civil rights movement, and the civil rights movement got a lot of its strength from the spiritual communities, because the spiritual communities were the places where people organized themselves. It was in churches that people learned what they needed to do in order to take action, and it was in spiritual communities where people actually organized themselves to take that action. So I think that spiritual communities can be the place where people get that, the sustenance that is a little deeper than data. Data is really important, but you you kind of run out of steam on data after a while if there's not something else to kind of carry you along. And I think that's what spiritual communities need to do now, is to offer the sustenance and the organizing place to get us to take action. So thinking about Seabrook, my understanding is that Seabrook was going to be bigger than it is now, and that people organized themselves and protested, and were you part of that? No, you were part of that. And showed up, bodily showed up at Seabrook. It wasn't...
Filled the prisons.
Yes, filled the prisons is what she said. So it wasn't a conversation with the EPA, it was
a direct action.
It was a direct action, physically being present, that changed how things went. Now there's still a power plant there that people aren't satisfied with, but it's different than it would have been because people physically showed up for something. So that's one of your options, is for us to organize ourselves in rooms like this one to physically show up places. You can organize your community, whether it's a Riverwoods community or your community of faith, to put solar panels on your roof. And we're, I'm not sure everyone in my congregation knows that right now, but we're in the process of collecting information about how to do that in our building around the corner and down the block. We have a small roof, but it's still a roof that could have solar panels on it that doesn't yet. And there are a lot of roofs in this town that could be generating electricity without more oil. So that's something that you could do. We've done a whole bunch of education in our congregation about water, how the water cycle works. Someone in our congregation came in with this fantastic 3D model that shows the surface of the earth, and then it shows the water table underneath, and it shows how the water flows in invisible ways, invisible to us when we're not sitting on the ground watching how water flows. So all the young people in our congregation understand that when you put fertilizer on your lawn, you messed with the Great Bay. All of our congregations in this town could do that. That could be one of the things that we evangelize about, is this is how we treat the earth as a sacred place. You remember that what you do to the grass outside of your front door affects the Great Bay and affects the air you breathe. To understand that cycle as part of what is sacred in the world is something that all of our communities could do.
The word sacred is one that's largely dropped out of public dialogue. We don't speak that way. When was the last time you heard a member of Congress, or the EPA, bless the EPA, but speak about something as sacred? So even the question of reclaiming that way of thinking and speaking publicly, that there are certain things that are sacred.
Thank you. I'm going to answer my own question.
Moderator's privilege.
I'm not going to say I'm going to answer it, but just speaking for myself, I've been radicalized in my life. I find myself theologically going further and further into something that looks like liberation theology. I went to a seminary, Episcopal Divinity School in Cambridge, that had a mantra: justice, compassion, and reconciliation. And I find that to be the path of Jesus, historically, literally. And I'm finding that to be a very effective message to people that I minister to. I preach liberation, and I've found since I've been ordained that people really respond to that. And they can interpret it however they like. But it gets to stuckness and just feeling incredibly small in the face of huge, huge danger and a need to liberate oneself and one's community. So I feel that my ministry, whatever it is and whatever it takes, I've been deemed really not the parish priest type here in New Hampshire. But it's going to manifest itself in some way in some kind of message of liberation. And I throw that out as one path that spiritual communities can take, that to emphasize, speaking up, basically. We've all spoken about speaking up, but how close our faith really can be to liberation, theology, really. Questions?
Sir. Can I just add a note of thanks to the professor for a tidbit he shared with us? I certainly learned something from him when he mentioned the buildup of the tidal floods as an indicator of sea level rise. And it's known from at least one source that I've read that sea level rise is an indicator we can all pay attention to. It's a major indicator of global warming. And that's really important because it gives us a practical, both of those give us a practical way of tracking what we're talking about. The evidence as to the sea level rise is unchallenged. And we're going to run into arguments with some people like ostriches who stick their heads in the sand, who deny the evidence. But sea level change is documented, and he's given us another indicator correlated with that. And for that I'm grateful, because we need to buttress ourselves with facts on the issue when we argue with people on the other side.
So, what are you going to do tomorrow, having had that buttress?
Excuse me?
What would be your first thing that you do tomorrow to act on this?
What I do?
I don't mean to single you out, but the thought occurs to me that we could talk all night.
All right.
And we can go out and say we had this great discussion, this great panel discussion, I learned a lot, and blah, 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 but what do? You don't have to answer this question, but what do we do?
I'd like to go along with the pastor. With all due respect to the sacerdotal quality of this panel, the sacredness of what we're talking about, as well as the scientific. We've got to raise hell. And that's what I'm going to do. I've been involved in politics as a serious hobby for 40 years, and I've written a couple of books on the subject, which basically emphasize we the people. What can we do? Well, we've got to get ourselves together, and we've got to get serious. Okay? Thank you.
I would say one thing that could be done, because I'm just looking at the indicators that the climate's changing, the birds are changing, the weeds are changing, the winters are changing, is to involve the elementary school level students in studying some of these things. What's been happening to the birds? I've noticed about 3 changes in what's showing up at our bird feeder. I'm noticing that the invasive weeds, which like CO2 by the way, are growing much better. This was a banner year for invasive plants, if anyone was maintaining a property. And those are the kind of things that are easily studied by students. Get them out there and take the data. And if you can get a long-term study going in a particular area and keep it going for over 5 years, that becomes useful research data. Educates the students doing it, which I think is the most important part. The second thing is if you do a good job, then that becomes a very important study. And then you can drag your politicians out, like Senator Shaheen, who's on appropriations. She has a great amount of influence, especially on energy issues and funding of these instrumentation we're talking about, of getting her to come out of the fundraisers and come, meet the students.
Yep,
And
we have that on the plan.
Nothing's more persuasive than a 9-year-old giving a presentation in climate change.
Where is that baby?
All right, well said.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
I have a question.
Yes, in the back.
One of the things that came up recently, we had an assembly speaker at Phillips Exeter who was making a strong pitch for us to push for divestment from fossil fuel companies. And as we listened to him, there was a panel that night discussing the pros and cons of this idea. And what emerged was the pretty direct line between a lot of fossil fuel companies and political practice, political action. And it wasn't that the dollar value of divestment was going to be anything that would, I mean, if the Academy divested all of its money from fossil fuels immediately, it would be completely inconsequential for any of those big companies. But the issue was to try to influence those companies to pay more attention to these issues, to not have such a direct pipeline, which no pun intended, but to projects like Keystone, so that some of those really big level, high level decisions that get made would have less influence directly from fossil fuels and more influence from what really is generally good for communities, what's best for the environment, what's best for the climate, and all of that. So, I mean, that's the kind of idea. I personally haven't made up my mind yet whether I think this divestment idea is but I think that the idea of looking globally at ways to make corporations more sensitive to these kinds of questions is a really, really important one for us. Because that's a macro level pressure.
Can I just publicly express my own confusion about exactly this question? There's a big part of me that says it's deceitful for me, if I were an institutional investor, to distance myself from making a profit on the ownership of investing in fossil fuel companies, while I still use their product. It seems there's something fundamentally wrong, as if one were to say, I'm no longer going to invest in the slave trade, but I'll still own slaves. And I haven't resolved this for myself yet. If I'm still complicit in the consumption of oil, does it really matter whether or not I profit from it? If I still use the product, and it's the use of the product that's the problem. So this is my own personal dilemma. I've wrestled with this. I don't know where I come down on it.
I think the point that they were trying to make was that you don't have options, really, about whether or not you use oil now. You don't have good options. I mean, Kendra was mentioning some of the...
They're relatively little things.
There are relatively little options, and that there's a reason for that. I guess that's what they were trying to point to, was to say that there's a reason why you're complicit. There's a reason why we're all complicit, because we're not developing the kinds of alternatives that we need to. And is there a way to exert pressure on that question? Because you're right.
But does divesting actually put any significant pressure on them? I don't know.
Yeah.
Depends what you invest in.
If you invest in alternative ways. Yeah.
I think part of the spiritual life is living with paradox, which is to say that you might inhabit two contradictory positions simultaneously. I think anything that you can do to tinker with the system that exists is of use. I was having the same debate in my head as we were talking about this. Well, let's see. Would it be more useful to stop driving my car or divest? I don't know. And then I thought, well, maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe all that matters is that we tinker with the system, that we don't let it persist as it is while we think about what to do, but that you try something that might fail grandly, actually, but it's worth trying something that will maybe tip something in a different way that we can't even anticipate, because divesting probably won't cause the oil companies to suddenly crash. And that would be bad for us because we have built our lives so completely on oil. But it might just start things shifting, and that's what we need. We need things to start shifting. And so any concrete step that you can take, whether it's figuring out how to carpool more or getting your institution to divest, whether it's showing up to figure out how to get some solar panels where there haven't been some, getting more information about the Great Bay. Any concrete thing that you can do starts to shift the system, and you can't see it soon enough. You know, it gets frustrating because you can't get tangible results immediately, but any step you take is of use.
Vegetarian, but becoming a near vegan. She's not all the way there yet. And I went and visited her about a month ago, and the first topic on her mind was, do you think that when I'm home for Christmas vacation for 3 weeks, we can have no meat in the house? And I had to think about that one for a minute, because I have a son who quite likes to eat chicken, mostly, and turkey, and things like that. We don't eat much red meat. But I do know that if you stop buying a product at a supermarket long enough, if you're a regular at a supermarket and you've been buying something regularly and then you suddenly stop, you know, if enough people do that, that sends a message in a very small way. And I'm wondering if we can use that message in a bigger context, if we can find those contexts. I'm going to put an end to the evening. It's already 9:15. We've been here a long time. We could stay, I think, another hour. There is a World Series game going on, which some of you may want to see the end of, because they all don't need to be seen until the last few innings. And so we're in good shape there. I want to kind of, first of all, I want to thank the panelists. Semra, Stephen, and We the People tries to do something with climate change or environmental issues every year. Last year was a little bit of a weak year for us, and this year we were determined to do some good stuff. So we're off to a good start, and thank you very much for all your work and for being here. If I could just quickly wrap it up. Sounds like what we hear is a lot of frustration with the big problem. And a solution, I won't call it a solution, but a way forwards to meet that big problem by working locally with small problems. And most importantly, to talk and to speak and to act up. The future doesn't look great to some, maybe to all, but we have to love each other, we have to love life, and we have to really want to care, to act, and to speak up. And maybe that's what we take from tonight, is no matter what's going on out there, we have to meet it with love, with compassion, with a sense of justice. We can't go home and just say we had a great conversation. Yeah. Think about it again next week. Tomorrow, do something. I don't know what, but do something. Before you go, fill out those little green cards. Is there anything that you learned here tonight that influences, that has any effect on that activity that you do with the environment? You can leave them on the table over there, just on the table, we'll collect them. And thank you very much for coming. Drive home safe.